Catherine, could you tell us a little bit about where you were in 1983, what you were doing, kind of how you heard about the peace camp?
Okay. I had been living in Provincetown, and I had been working on a book project that I was involved with at the time as a photographer. And I met someone, and I can't remember who it was, who started talking to me about the peace camps in Europe and telling me that I needed to go there and photograph. So when my lease was up, I was only in Provincetown temporarily. And I think June came around and my lease was up. And I decided to go to Europe and photograph the peace camp movement in Europe. And that was the era when there were demonstrations of 900,000, 1 million people in major cities in Europe to keep the Pershing and cruise missiles from coming to Europe under Ronald Reagan. And so I went and I traveled the length and breadth of Europe hitchhiking. I hitchhiked twice from the top of Scotland to the boot of Italy, twice by myself in that summer. So strong was my resolve to, help in any way I could to stop this nuclear missile system from happening. So I went from the top of Scotland, which was, I can't remember the name of that one. Do you guys remember?
Wales.
The camp there?
The camp there. It wasn't Hereford, it was, anyway, to Comiso, to the women's camp in Comiso. I have great pictures of all of that, really beautiful stuff. And so when I came back, my friend Andrea Kirsch picked me up at the airport and we drove to Seneca. And that was that. And I stayed there. And it was an extension of this, photography project, that was also a very personal, obviously, project to photograph what was happening in America as well. So, and I loved it so much, I ended up staying the whole summer. Ended up staying until October.
So over that summer, did you participate in actions as well as?
Oh, totally. Yeah, I did. Basically, I was documenting. I was photographing. But then I took on the assignment of food coordinator. I don't know if you remember that, but I was the food coordinator of the peace camp for the whole summer, which was an unbelievable. It was unbelievable to do that. So I was responsible for. I went all over the area, all the counties there, collecting free food. Free tofu, free soy milk, free, zucchinis. You remember the zucchinis? Free zucchinis, and sort of keeping the kitchen marginally together, and sort of setting up, getting the crew together for dinner. I don't know if you even knew that all this was going on, but it went on every single day, where there was volunteers for dinner, and then we would go through what was there, and we would decide what was going to happen, and my thing was that I was actually trying to educate about food at the same time. By keeping things really simple, by trying to keep the food simple and, kind of Zen-like. And, I remember one rule that we had was no more than 3 ingredients in any particular, supper, so that things stayed simple. And the idea was that if we nourished ourselves well on the highest level, that our activism and our actions would really benefit, would really reap the harvest that we were trying to reap, which it did in the end, actually.
I do remember some of that garden because it was my first exposure to really, there were certain things that should be eaten together.
Yes, food combining, all of that. We were trying to, infiltrate, some of that information into it. Because you remember, I don't know if you remember how chaotic it could become. And I was there all the time trying to get it to be, simple and organized and clean and, all that stuff. So that was a huge main job that I did for the whole summer. I remember raising my hand in one of those early circles. Well, who would like to be food coordinator? I remember my hand going up as if it was a puppet on a string. Who said that? So I kind of stayed out of jail because I always had my camera with me. I did go over the fence, and I remember at one point going over the fence and leaving my camera behind and getting arrested and spending a night or something like that in jail. I do remember that, and handing my camera off to somebody and just going over the fence once. And I was there for like every action practically, up and down that road and photographing, But I felt more like a support person, for the people who were actually going over the fence all the time. And I did a lot of support stuff, food-wise, all that kind of thing.
Right.
Prior to the Europe trip, did you know that the Peace Camp at Seneca was existent?
I knew it was being organized because friends of mine in New York City, and I don't know, I can't remember if that was like where it first started, in New York City.
What
I
we
can't
heard
remember.
from women who talk about it is the Pentagon actions were happening in 81, and they were very
And
much
82.
germinating the idea of
And I was involved in the Women's Pentagon actions. Yeah, definitely. Surrounding the Pentagon, making it disappear, that kind of thing. I was involved in that, yeah. So I must have known. I must have had an inkling because I was pretty plugged in at that time, into all kinds of things. And so I probably knew, and I probably, organized this trip to Europe. I think it was 6 weeks that I went to Europe and did this, and then came back and had it all planned that I would be there for the opening of the Seneca Women's Peace Encampment, and I was there for the first day, yeah.
And when you and Andrea arrived, did you have a sense of how long you planned to stay or what would happen?
No idea.
Just came. And the photographs that you took across Europe, how did they become a part of your life or other people's lives, or what happened?
Well, I did a lot of slideshows, especially after Seneca, presentations and slideshows and publishing and, all kinds of things. I can't quite remember all of it now, but it was a very fertile, very active time, for me. A lot of attention, a lot of action, with my work. It was a great time.
At what point did you put the book together?
The book I put together with Christina, I guess after, that fall, 1984. The Peace Camp ended, my recollection, for me, it ended in October of 1983. And so then we worked on this. Christina and I were living together at the time. Then we went to Nicaragua in 1984. That was intense. That was incredible too. So all that came out of, Seneca. It just never stopped for me. Then I went to South Africa, and for 10 years I worked on issues in South Africa. Yeah. I wasn't there for 10 years. I was living in New York City, but back and forth.
And did you come back to the camp?
I think the first year I certainly did. But I can't quite remember, how many times or... No, I just don't remember exactly.
And were there relationships that you made at the camp that continued over a period of time?
Definitely. I think I met Betsy Bauer at the Peace Camp. And she remains today one of my best friends. There's a whole, Laura Flanders is still a friend of mine, still a good friend of mine. Can't remember if I met Satway there or if I knew Satway before. Samoa, I met there. I saw her for a long time until she moved here and then had a child, and I've talked to her on the phone since then, but I haven't actually seen her since then. Cassandra White. Yeah, any number of women that I still see, but now because there have been so many experiences since then, I'm not quite sure, was it Seneca or was it, post-Seneca or...
Is there anything specific that you remember that you gotten specifically from Seneca?
I think it really deepened my commitment, my awareness, and made me, I've been an activist for a long time, really since I was 14 years old. Through the Vietnam War, through the feminist movement, through the gay movement, through the peace movement, lots of different movements coalescing. But Seneca certainly was very special. Was very special. It was all women. It just kept me, a commitment was made, I think, to maintain, to be an activist, to really be, to stay an activist, to be an activist and to stay an activist, and it was just so much fun. I mean, where else would you want to be? If you knew about it, where else would you could you possibly want to be? Every day it was just a complete malarkey. I mean, and it was an anarchist community, would you say? It was just so much fun. I mean, every day it was fun. Every minute it was fun.
What made it work? Because it was such an anarchistic community.
I think it was a wave that had a time and was a moment. Just like right now, we're having the same kind of experience of how is this possibly happening? The Barack Obama phenomena. It just has risen, in the cultural landscape. And that's what happened back then, too. And it's hard to remember because it's not happening on that level now for us. Now, it might be happening for those young people who are involved in, like, the anti-globalization campaigns or the animal rights campaigns or some of the other campaigns that are really happening right now. I think it has partly to do with the time of our lives that it was happening. I mean, I was in my early 30s when that was happening. And I can't imagine doing it now, because it really was quite chaotic. I'm not sure I could handle it. And I would if I had to. Like, if there was something that had to happen, I would surely be there. It took a certain kind of energy, I think, which is youthful, which I think is what's happening in the globalization movement now. Like, I am completely supportive of the anti-globalization movement, but I have not been able to get actively involved, going to Seattle, going to the conferences in Europe and all that. And I probably would have been doing that if I were younger. Right. The police are much scarier now. Yeah. However, I think we've turned a corner on that. We went down a very dark path. We went down a path where we were at risk of losing our democracy, and we did lose pieces of it. I think people have woken up. I don't think we're going to let that happen now again. for a very long time until another generation kind of forgets. But I think this movement that I've just seen and have been involved with to elect Barack Obama has been a kind of taking back our country, our democracy, whatever you want to call it, our freedom. We've taken it back on the only way it could have been taken back, and that's by the people. And it wasn't in the street. It was online. It was in another world, another galaxy, in cyberspace, another space where the organizing happened. So you didn't have to go anywhere. I mean, it was so amazing. You could be completely involved, and you didn't have to go anywhere. We didn't have the internet.
No.
In 1983. Think of what Seneca would have been like had we had the internet. We probably would have had, 1 million people. And you know what I remember? I have a great picture of this. It's not in the book, or maybe it is in the book, of Bella Abzug in the closet, making phone calls to the governor. I know, imagine, the whole thing would have been so different. And so somehow the internet and our ability to communicate the way we can communicate now has conditioned our activism. I mean, everybody knows this. I mean, MoveOn.org can mobilize millions of people in a minute. So it's a whole different world. We've been in a real sort of scary fascisty moment. And it's similar to the Reagan moment, in my opinion. It has been a similar moment with Bush. It's been pushing in that same direction, covert action. But I think we've turned a corner, a big corner, that goes back to the Reagan era. The work that we were doing in Seneca has led to this moment now, because all that work that we did in classism and racism and consensus process and talking to your enemy. Do you remember talking to those people from Romulus and trying to discuss with them? That was amazing work that we did.
Do you remember any specific conversations that you had, or
I don't remember the conversations, but I remember the people, and I remember the resolve that I had to be Gandhi, to meet these people who really wanted to kill us. And if they had their druthers, they would have. Meeting that energy with an open heart, with peace in mind, was a tremendous lesson. For me, personally, I think for all of us who had to go up against them, who went up against those people, on a daily basis, which we did. We went up against the same people. There's this one, here they are. Nuke them till they glow and then shoot them in the dark. That's what they said about us. They were serious. Those people were serious. If we hadn't had the police in between us, it would have been a very different story.
And strange that it wasn't them that the police arrested.
Well, that's right. I mean, that was, the police are they're part of the state apparatus. They're not, it's a complicated subject, but, in this case, we were basically attacking a military installation. The police were called out, to keep us from doing that. There's a piece in the New York Times today, and this guy was on Charlie Rose. He is a Harvard professor who either taught Obama or taught with Obama. And he talks about the linkage of the women's movement and the civil rights movement going back to abolitionist days. And he talks about that connection. He talks about how integral the women's movement was to the election of Barack Obama.
Do you remember any conversations about, like whether shaking the fence was an okay thing or cutting the fence? Do you remember any discussions around any of those?
I remember discussions, but I don't remember anything
Yeah.
specifically. I wouldn't remember.
Yeah.
I remember there were lots of discussions. And part of being a photographer was sort of being able to stay out of that realm of things. That really wasn't my realm, getting into all those discussions. It's still not my realm. It's not what I like to do. I don't like to get into long, complicated, difficult discussions. I just like sort of standing outside and being a witness and photographing. I wouldn't want, that's not how I would be best used. And I'm still to this day, it's just not where I like to spend my energy. Getting attached to my position and then fighting for, or whatever, even building consensus around it.
Did you spend a lot of time at those meetings?
Only photographing them. I did not spend a lot of time engaged in those discussions, no.
The time that you spent in Europe before you got to the encampment, what did you remember at the time some differences between what you saw in Europe or what you brought from your experiences in Europe to what Seneca was as an encampment?
Seneca was an American encampment, and it was American women, but the structure, the vibrancy, the rough and tumble of it, it was the same, the commitment, on those levels, it was the same. I did go to some peace camps that were mixed, men and women, and those were interesting, but it was the same sort of basic setup. I mean, Seneca was modeled on Greenham Common. They all were modeled on Greenham Common because Greenham Common was the first. So all the other peace camps had a flavor that you first felt at Greenham. That you felt at Seneca. It was the peace camp movement had a kind of identity or a flavor, a spirit.
Did you meet women from Europe or Greenham at Seneca?
Yeah, the first two women who crossed the line, which is really one of the great pictures I think in this book, is Becky and Cassandra. They were the very first women who went across that line, and they were both from Greenham.
And they were young.
And they were very young.
So young.
They were very young.
Can you, just for folks that don't know what we're talking about, what the line was? And what
the line was, you crossed the line, you got arrested. And it was scary to cross that line because you didn't really know what was going to happen when you got arrested. And they went first. They were the first, and it was right then. It was just after that moment. They went across.
It was just a yellow line.
It was a yellow line on the ground.
Was there something significant about the fact that they were Greenham women that did it?
I think so. They were ready. They'd seen it. They'd done it. They were brave. They had been there. They'd done it already. It's not as if we, the women from Seneca, waited for them to cross the line. No, they went. It's not as if there were women clamoring to go first. No, they went first. They took the step, which allowed a lot of other steps to be taken. They did it because they were brave. Maybe.
What was your personal understanding of nonviolence in that time?
I had been a student of nonviolence, of Gandhi, since the civil rights movement. I was very young, but I was still, involved, and wanting to know more. I was involved in the Vietnam War demonstrations, always as a nonviolent activist. when I was in college, there was a lot of activity going on. I started college in 1967. So I was involved in a lot of activism and a lot of demonstrations, a lot of discussion of how it should go. And I always took the stand of nonviolence. I don't know where exactly that came from, in me. It's just where I stood. And during the Vietnam War demonstrations, there was a lot of violence. On my college campus, there was a lot of violence and a lot of trashing of property. It's not that I condemned that stand. It's just wasn't my stand. And I remember during the demonstrations at my college, Stanford, there were lines of people throwing Molotov cocktails and like screaming at the police, and then the police were on the other side, and they were beating on people, and there was this group of us who would try to put ourselves in between the two and just stand there for nonviolence for both in both sides, because I believed Martin Luther King. That was my teacher. I felt that the ultimate change would come about through nonviolence, not through violence. And I didn't want to participate in violence, and I never have wanted to, and I never have. I never have gone that route. It's not that I condemned it. I don't. It's just people have their different paths, in these kinds of conflicts. I mean, I spent 10 years working in South Africa, and I knew people who were getting killed and who were killing. And I never condemned them for that, because obviously in that situation it would be a hard line to draw. What made the difference? The people who were bombing and sabotaging, or the people who were standing in the Gandhian tradition of nonviolence. And Nelson Mandela was not standing in the Gandhian tradition of nonviolence. He was part of the Spear of the Nation, which was the violent wing of the African National Congress. That's why he was in prison for such a long time. But, you had people in both of those camps in South Africa, and I just simply, my camp has always been the nonviolent camp. Which is to say that I would not condemn what those people did. In fact, I support it. Not with my physical body, because I can't. It just doesn't, that would not work for me. I believe in nonviolence. I actually believe in it. I really believe in it. It might take longer. That's why I love the Dalai Lama. He's never backed off of that. And he's gotten a lot of criticism, from young people in Tibet. But he's never backed down off of that. And that's just where I am also.
And did you find kinship among women that you met at Seneca in terms of that belief system?
Yeah, oh sure. I think that was the main emphasis. Rabble rousers, yes, but nonviolent, committed, dedicated to that Gandhian principle of nonviolence, satyagraha.
One of the things women have talked about over and over again is the painting of the water tower. Mm-hmm. Some people thought that property damage was violence.
I don't believe that property damage is violence.
In your opinion?
No. I think there's quite a long way between property damage and, hurting people. And myself personally, I've never damaged property. I just don't want to do that, do that kind of damage. But I don't know. situations sometimes really call for it. I mean, what made the difference, you know, in what some of the things that I remember really making a difference in the Vietnam War movement against the war were the bombing of the Bank of America in Santa Barbara, the burning down of the ROTC building on my own campus. You know, those kinds of things, they made a difference because people respond to that. You know, people respond to that. But I personally, you know, maybe I just wouldn't have the guts for it. You know, but I just, you know, it just wasn't my thing. You know, it wasn't the people that I was surrounded by weren't going there, weren't doing that.
Being a young activist, what kind of reaction or support or non-support did your family exhibit?
I don't think they had the clue what I was doing. Not a clue. And when I think, well, I used to write long, you know, heartfelt letters to them. My father was certainly an activist in his own right. Not to the extent that I have been, but he was certainly on my side. My mother, however, grew more and more on my side as things went on, but I don't think they had a clue what I was doing. When I think about hitchhiking from the top of Scotland to the bottom of Italy twice by myself in one summer, and the experiences that I had trying to do that, I think, how could I mean, the fact that I survived it is pretty incredible. But if my mother had had the slightest idea of what I was doing, I don't know what, you know, I just don't have any idea what she would have done. She didn't know. She didn't have a clue what I was up to. She didn't approve of me, you know, basically, because I was gay, you know, but...
Are you an only child?
No, no.
What was your family makeup? Brothers?
I have a brother who died just last winter in an avalanche. Oh. I had a young sister who was quite an activist herself. She was at the Poor People's Campaign March in whenever that was, 1965, in Washington, D.C. And she died when she was 18. And now I just have me and my sister. Both of my parents are dead. So everything is impermanent. The peace camp, you know, my mother, your mother.
Right.
You know, you do the best, you know. Yeah, it's fascinating. I just don't think, you know, violence I think is important. I think people who can do it, it obviously has a place in our universe because it's so prevalent. And I wanted to go back to also right before Seneca in 1982, one of the things that I did was I did the World Peace Walk with the Buddhist monks that went to New York City for the second special session on disarmament in 1982. So I walked 900 miles from Montreal to New York City, chanting for, you know, to support the second special session on disarmament. That was the largest gathering in America up until that point. 1 million people in Central Park. I don't know if you remember that, but there were 5 walks that converged, and I was on one of those walks. So that was very important to me to be with these Buddhist monks for that extended period of time, walking. And we did lots of actions, we did lots of things. We sat at Groton, overlooking the Trident submarine manufacturing plant. We did all night chanting in the rain. And I saw that this was more powerful than those nuclear weapons that they were building. I just saw it as clear as day during that all night chanting, sitting in the rain in banana boxes with garbage bags over, keeping us dry. And I think that, confirmed my being a nonviolent activist.
how big a march
It
handed?
started with 12 people
Uh-huh.
in Montreal in a blizzard, and it ended with 80 people in New York City. And we stopped in all these little towns and, spoke, and, it was an organizing tool,
Uh-huh.
the march itself.
And had you been a Buddhist?
Yes, I had been a Buddhist peripherally since the 70s. I began meditation practice in 1971, and I took various teachings and, various vows, precepts and all of that in the 70s. I took the Bodhisattva vow in 1980. Well, the Bodhisattva vow basically says, I vow to return until all sentient beings are liberated. So that means that even if you as an individual become enlightened, and this is all in the Buddhist cosmology of reincarnation, that if you become enlightened and don't really have to come back to this world of birth and death and suffering, that you will come anyway to help others. So that's what it's been about for me ever since then. Well, how can I help? And sometimes that how can I help is something like Seneca, and sometimes that how can I help is going on a month-long meditation retreat. And being as quiet and as silent as you can be. But my experience is that most Buddhists are quite good activists. We were stopping it. We didn't stop it. Unfortunately, we didn't. We probably stopped some of it, but we had to do what we had to do. We had to try, and we did. I mean, Greenham Common is now a commons again. Seneca is closed. I don't quite know where everything goes now. The military-industrial complex is huge. It's enormous, but I'm feeling, this is a long-term process. And what we did in Seneca is manifesting now and into the future. It wasn't one summer. It was a trajectory, that is still manifesting now in the election of a peace candidate for president of this country. He voted against the Iraq War. We have never had that, especially in a time of war, to elect a candidate who is so clearly an anti-war candidate, and maybe even more so than we can imagine. But I really feel that he is going to stop all this nonsense. So not by himself, but I think the time is now. People, this movement, it's a movement through time. That was a moment of the movement through time, but it is continuing in the hearts and minds of the generation that is following us.
Do you remember at the time having any feeling of once those missiles were deployed?
We were terrified. Don't you remember? We were absolutely terrified. What was it? How many minutes to midnight? That whole thing. We were on the brink of nuclear war. We felt that. I think we felt that, and that's why, hundreds of that, 900,000, 1 million, 800,000 in every major city in Europe that summer. Hundreds of thousands of people. We had to do our part over here.